So, I'd like to talk to you about a little bit of a radical idea today, and that radical idea is that the middle class does not really exist. When we typically think of a social hierarchy, most of us think of it this way. We might have been shown this social pyramid in school, or you might have seen it when you were growing up, and basically we imagine society to have these nice, clean divisions between a working or lower class, a middle class, and an upper class. Well, today I would like to make a case that our social hierarchy actually looks a lot more like this. You have a teeny tiny sliver of the population that is what I would call the elite class. You have a slightly bigger but still very teeny tiny sliver of the population, which I would call the true middle class. And then you have a gigantic portion encompassing pretty much everybody that I call the true working class. Now, what do I mean by working class? Because usually when you hear the term working class, you might think of, okay, a blue collar worker perhaps, or a lower income worker perhaps. It's typically the social norm of what we call the working class. I have a little bit of a different definition for it. What I call the working class is just simply anyone who must sell their labor to survive. In other words, anyone who must work. That is the working class. It's pretty straightforward, right? But this means that it encompasses everyone from burger flippers to bankers, right? From lawyers, doctors, to baristas. It's anybody who has to go to work on Monday morning. Now, obviously, this is a little bit of a crazy thing to say, right? It's a little bit of a radical idea because typically we don't think of bankers and baristas or burger flippers in the same social class. And I'm sure I might upset some people by saying that. So let me unpack this a little bit more so you can understand where I'm coming from here. If we imagine, two people, let's say, let's imagine a banker and let's imagine a burger flipper, which I have drawn for you beautifully here. In the burger flipper's world, the kinds of choices available to them in life are, of course, different than someone who's a banker because let's say the burger flipper is roughly making minimum wage and the banker is making multiple six figures. Okay. So in that kind of world, the burger flipper might drive a Honda. They might shop for groceries at somewhere like No Frills, which is a more budget-oriented grocery store in the country I live, at least. And they might live in, a simple apartment. Whereas the banker might drive a BMW, might drive a luxury car. They might shop at Whole Foods for their groceries, and they might live in a beautiful, 4, 5, 6 bedroom home. Who knows? So of course they have these different kinds of choices available to them in life. But the one choice that they share, the one choice that they both don't get to make, is that they both have to trade the use of their bodies and or their minds. They have to trade the use of them. They have to sell the use of them. They have to rent the use of them for the majority of their day in exchange for resources that they're going to use to try and survive in the minority of their day, right? And so this is just a fancy way of essentially saying it's like, yes, those people get to make different choices because of the money they have in terms of where they're going to live, what they're going to buy, that type of thing. But the one choice they don't get to make is whether or not they go to work on Monday morning. And this, as we will see, is very significant that they both share this. And that's because, well, most of us, when we think of work, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. We just think, okay, I have to work because I have to contribute something to society, right? I have to contribute my labor to society to keep the world turning. And when I contribute my labor to society, I'm going to receive money in return. We can think of this money as just society bucks or society credits, right? Pays us back. And then we use these society credits to then trade for the things that we want and need in our life. That's how most of us think about work. It's pretty straightforward. But I would suggest to you that there's a lot more going on here. And I created this idea that I call the work iceberg. to illustrate this. Because what I just described about work just being this thing where we need to contribute to it and we get money back and then we use the money to buy the things we want and need, that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because there's all this stuff below the surface that we don't really talk about as much, and we kind of just take it for granted for some reason that this is the way work works. But what's really under the surface of this iceberg is the fact that to work, especially to be employed by someone else, especially in large corporate environments, let's say, means giving up control of all of these really essential parts of your being, such as when you must wake up, how you must dress, where you must be, what you must do, who you must speak to, how you must speak to them, what cultures and beliefs you have to conform to, when and for how long you can take breaks, and when you can stop and go home for the day. In other words, the bottom of this iceberg illustrates the fact that work controls the vast majority of your life, because all this stuff that work controls about you, well, it controls that about you for the majority of your day, the majority of the days of the week, across the majority of your adult life. And this control doesn't only apply to burger flippers, it also applies to bankers. That's why I describe all of these people who are subject to this kind of control as the working class. And if you want to know, sorry, my baby's just yelling. You might hear him in the background a little bit. If you want to know more about, thinking and seeing work in under this different light, I've actually been putting together a playlist called How Work Works. So if this is interesting to you, you might consider checking that out. So that's why I think of this pyramid as really looking like this, right? As having a huge amount of people subject to being in the working class because they have no choice but to sell their labor to survive, and they have to subject themselves to this form of control, basically. Now, you might still be objecting to this, right? Because you still might be kind of like hanging on to the idea where it's like, well, yeah, okay, they do both have to go into work on Monday, but the work they do has very different reward sets for each of those people. And that might mean that the burger flipper might be subject to a lot more control than the banker. Well, let's continue to unpack this a little bit further, and let's actually look at some numbers here. Let's put some numbers on the board. So by my estimation, the elite class is actually composed of just 0.1% of the population. And that's because it's basically this group of just over 200,000 people who have a net worth over $30 million. As you can hear, my little baby boy's getting very riled up about this. He's very riled up about the elite class. So the cutoff to be in the elite class is $30 million net worth, in excess of. Then we have the true middle class, which makes up just about 1% of the population of about 2.4 million people. And these are people who have a net worth between $5 million and $30 million. Everyone else falls in the working class, which is about 99% of the population. And that's going to be anyone who has a net worth below $5 million, essentially. And the vast majority of people have a net worth below $1 million in this class, right? As you can see the way it breaks down. Now, the one area, and I've put a little asterisk there for this reason, the one area you might be kind of looking at and being like, that part doesn't make sense, is the fact that I have about 22 million people with a net worth between 1 million and 5 million in the working class. Because you might think to yourself, how can someone with a net worth of like, let's say $3 million really be a member of the working class? That doesn't add up, Steve. I'm confused there. Shouldn't they maybe be in the middle class? And it's like, you could make an argument in that sense. I'm going to make an argument in the other sense as we continue to go on here and look at even more numbers. But it's like, yeah, it's a valid point to make. And so if I just granted that to you, well, it's like we'll probably move about another 9% of the population to the middle class. So your true middle class is maybe about 10% of the population. I mean, it doesn't really change things that much, right? It's like you still have, a working class of 90% of the population who's subject to control. And so that, it's somewhat of a change, but it's not really a huge change. But I'm going to argue against that, and I'm going to argue that they should actually belong in the working class. They're about to escape the working class. They're in the process of escaping it for sure. They're at the top end of it, but they're still in the working class. And that's because basically I draw my lines in the hierarchy based off something known as economic independence. And so what we find is that the elite class is actually the members of society who are fully economically independent, right? And what that means is they don't have to rely on anyone or anything outside of themselves to be able to produce or procure what they need to survive. So, in ancient times, economic independence meant having your own land. Because if you could have your own land, it meant you could grow your own food and you could provide for yourself, right? Today, the equivalent of like owning agriculturally producing land for yourself is kind of like owning enough money, enough capital, because enough capital kind of becomes like this farm for yourself, right? If you have X number of $1 million, you invest that, you're going to earn a lot of money from that. It's kind of like your money grows, crops for yourself in a sense, and then you can just use that newly created money to buy what you want and need. So the elite class is, of course, fully economically independent because they have a net worth over $30 million, and that's going to be able to cover them. Absolutely. But the unique thing that the elite class also has is they also have the power to command other people. And this is very important because this type of social hierarchy is a dominance and command hierarchy. The elite class is kind of in charge of everybody else. They're in charge of the capital of society, which means they're essentially in charge of allocating that, which means they're in charge of allocating the resources of society, which means they're essentially in charge of everybody. Below them, you have the middle class, and how I kind of classify them is that they are also fully economically independent, right? And that's because they have this net worth between $5 and $30 million. So they're also definitely going to be fully economically independent. But the thing that the middle class does not have is they do not have the power to control other people. They do not have the power to command large amounts of the population. And we'll see why in just a second. Then finally, the working class, the characteristics they have is that they are economically dependent, right? They do not have the power to provide for themselves. They are dependent, which means that they need to access the resources they want through the people who have the power to provide it for them. In other words, they don't have enough money for themselves, so they have to sell their labor to survive because they need the money from the people who have it so that they can get it and then they can use that money to trade for the things they need and want, right? So in other words, you have a huge, at least 90% of the population is subject to economic dependence, which forces them into labor, right? And of course, they also do not have the power to command other people, right? Which means they certainly do not have the power to command themselves. And so their lives are largely outside of their control because they have to give up control of their bodies and or minds for the majority of the days of the week, across the majority of their adult lives. Now let's dive into some more numbers in terms of how all of this stuff continues to break down. So for the elite class to actually be fully economically independent, the way I classify that is they have a net worth that is in excess of a lifetime annual subsistence. Okay, so let's break that down. So a lifetime annual subsistence, the way I calculate that is, we'll flip to the next page quickly here and then we'll go back. I calculate basically based off MIT's living wage calculator. As a general rule of thumb, you could say a minimum annual subsistence would be about $30,000. Obviously, there's a huge fluctuation depending on like where you live and stuff like that. But I think we can, so that we don't have to overcomplicate things too much, if we're just looking for a very, very general minimum annual subsistence income for one single person, it's probably about $30,000. And remember, this is minimum, right? It's minimum. This would just get you the bare necessities. So that's $30,000. Now, a lifetime annual subsistence, what we're doing is we're essentially applying this formula here which is like a cost of freedom calculation. It's the exact same calculation you would do to calculate your own retirement, because retirement calculations are just a cost of freedom calculation, right? And it's like all you're calculating is how much money would I need to never work again, right? Most people just calculate that super far out into the future, in their 50s or 60s, because they're like, that's probably when I'll have enough money to never work again. That's all retirement is, right? That's it. It's just, when will I have enough money to never work again? So it's a cost of freedom calculation. We're just calculating that as if the person were going to be free today, right? And so that works out to be about $3 million when we consider things like 2% inflation, and if a person had a life expectancy of around 80 years, and they were like a postgraduate student who was just starting work after 22, basically. So all of that is to say, the elite class is fully economically independent because they definitely exceed that $3 million threshold for a lifetime annual subsistence, right? In other words, they have enough money that they would never have to work another day in their life, according to meeting the bare necessities at least. And of course, the elite class has much, much, much more than that. And the other unique characteristic that we just discussed about the elite class is they also have the power to command other human beings. And specifically, they actually have the power to command at least 1,000 other human beings, and that's because they control the equivalent access to resources of 1,000 human beings' wages, right? Because if we think, okay, a minimum annual subsistence is about $30,000. Well, people in the elite class control over 1,000 times $30,000, which means that they could provide a living for at least 1,000 individuals in that sense. So they control access to the equivalent resources for them, right? And that's typically the way that actually breaks down, is just that they end up employing thousands of individuals, right? They give jobs to thousands of individuals. So they have the power to command others. Now, in the elite class, they also have a net worth in excess of a lifetime annual subsistence, right? So they have a net worth in excess of $3 million, so they're fully independent, but they do not have the power to command other human beings in the same way the elite class does, because they do not have a net worth that is in excess of 1,000 times the annual subsistence of others. They do not have a net worth in excess of $30 million, right? And then finally, we have the working class, which is, of course, dependent, because they do not have a net worth that is in excess of a lifetime annual subsistence for the most part. And they absolutely do not have the power to command 1,000 other human beings. So they're dependent, which means they can't even command themselves. So they definitely can't command other people. And so now you can kind of see how this breaks down, right? It's like the elite class are fully independent and they can control other people. The middle class is fully independent, meaning they've basically escaped the working class. That's what the middle class is composed of. It's like the escapees from the working class. But they're also not quite powerful enough to be serious players in the domain of like controlling people, right? They probably don't employ, if they have businesses or whatever, they probably don't employ huge amounts of people. And so basically what this breaks down to is the fact that I'm not going to be making like a moral judgment necessarily on whether or not the social pyramid should look like this, right? I'm merely like, I'm not going to be making any prescriptive statements about it. I'm just telling you how it actually functions, right? This is more of in the sense of realism. This is just actually the way it works. And so all of this to say is basically that ever since we adopted agriculture, essentially you've had to force at least 90% of the population into labor. And the way you've had to force them into labor is by making them economically dependent, right? You had to force them to do it. That's because we needed huge amounts of bodies. First to work the fields, then to work the factories, and now to continue to work in information technology, as well as the fields and the factories, right? And so basically what you have is when you study history, you realize that history has actually been composed of various stages that have these core labor units associated with it. So in the human age, which is basically in my chronology of history, I call the human age basically the period that existed before agriculture. And I'm not going to get into why I call that in this particular video. We'll talk about it another time. But basically, this was the age that you had essentially everyone was hunter-gatherers, right? And as hunter-gatherers, we actually had the opposite hierarchy. We had an upside-down triangle hierarchy. That's because it was a reverse dominance hierarchy. And a reverse dominance hierarchy is basically just the idea that the collective actually dominated the would-be dominators, right? If typically what happens in a lot of these hunter-gatherer tribes, when you look at them, is that they actually band together to oppress the people who would try and oppress them. So if any one single individual gets too cocky, or they try to take too much power for themselves, they become too authoritarian, the group actually conspires against that single person. When we adopted agriculture, we completely flipped that to now have a very, very small group of people who are the dominators, and they dominate everyone else. So you have a normal dominance hierarchy now, right? And once we switched to a normal dominance hierarchy and made the vast majority of people part of this dependent working class, you essentially, in the agricultural age, you had slaves filling a huge amount of that role. You had serfs filling a huge amount of that role. You had peasants filling a huge amount of that role. You know, what's funny is when you look, like, when we typically think about history, it's like, you know, we might talk about like kings and queens and all these great figures and stuff like that, like when we study history, but we don't typically think about that everyone was essentially like a peasant, right? Like the vast, vast majority of people were just farming peasants. We don't talk about them. Their stories aren't really written. But if you and I lived X number of years ago, 9.9 times out of 10, it's like that's what we would have been. We typically don't think about that. And we also don't typically think about how nothing's really changed, and we might kind of be that today. And we'll continue. I'll continue to progress in that direction, and we'll make the case there. But basically, as you move into the industrial age, then you also have slaves making a huge part of the labor force. It's not obvious that they're part of the labor force because the slavery is happening in periphery zones, right? It's not actually happening in the center. So like, for instance, industrial Britain, it's like, yeah, there might not necessarily been like, a huge slave operation working the factories there, but in the peripheries of society, Africa, South America, or America in general, all the India, all these places, you had obviously imperialism and colonialism, having those people contribute to the industrialism as forced laborers, essentially. Now, if you extend this chronology of history out into the future, because it's like, okay, we're actually still in the industrial age in my chronology. We're just at like the very end of it. And you can realize that when you realize most of the bones of our civilization today are still extremely industrial. In the digital age, once we cross the threshold of AI and all that stuff, you're going to have a huge amount of the labor force be composed of digital and robotic slaves, right? For sure. So I'd like to actually take you through history and look at these social hierarchies so you can actually get an idea of how they looked back then, and then we can compare it and contrast it to the social hierarchy we have today. So if we kind of want to trace like the general lineage of Western civilization across some of the most prominent civilizations in that lineage, like for instance, if we want to start with somewhere like ancient Egypt, we can look at their social hierarchy and we can get a rough estimation that probably the working class was composed of like 99% of the population, right? And these estimations come from my study of history, and these are part of my book manuscript that I'm writing about the history of work. If we look next to somewhere like ancient Sparta, a little bit further in the future, we can see that the working class was about probably 90 to 95% of the population. In ancient Athens, in their kind of golden democratic period, we could say, their working class was still 95 to 98% of the population, which was extremely economically independent. The Roman Republic was actually a bit more of a unique period in that the working class was actually relatively smaller. And that's because the Roman Republic had this really interesting ideal that they kind of founded the Republic on in the beginning, and they tried to uphold for as long as they could. And that ideal they tried to found it on was this idea of the soldier, farmer, citizen. And the idea of that was that every citizen of the Roman Republic should have their own land, and they should also have their own arms to be able to not only defend themselves, but also to come together collectively to defend Rome. And they thought that if every citizen had land, meaning they could provide for themselves, be economically independent, and they could also defend themselves and defend Rome together, you'd have this very, very strong citizenry, right? It was this amazing ideal. And it worked for a very long time. I mean, that's what gave birth to the amazingly interesting civil and powerful civilization that was Rome. And this same soldier, farmer, citizen ideal was actually attempted to be established at the onset of America after the American Revolution, right? Every citizen, what they classified as citizens, at least in the beginning, was land-holding people who also were able to bear arms, right? That was very similar to Rome in this regard. Now, obviously, it was pretty exclusionary in terms of who could own land and stuff like that. But the seed of this idea of having citizens who were economically independent and who could protect themselves and protect the collective together was revolutionary and tends to make very strong civilizations. Unfortunately, that ideal is very hard to maintain, and it usually becomes corrupted. And we can see that as Rome transitioned from the Republic into the Empire, that very much fell away, and the working class climbed way back up into the high 90s because the vast majority of people lost their land. Wealth accumulated in very few hands, and and then ultimately, I mean, that was a part of a big contributing factor to the fall of Rome altogether. And following that, then you can look at medieval Europe and say, wow, working class was extremely high in that type of world. Middle class was very small because, towns and centers of commerce weren't really established yet. So pretty much everyone was like a peasant or serf of some kind. And you could go into the early modern era, say, okay, towns and commerce are starting to develop a little bit. So the middle classes of wealthy townspeople is growing a little bit more. But the working class is still extremely substantial. And then finally, you can look at something like industrial Britain and say, okay, the working class is actually about 90% here, which you could roughly maybe map onto our current period as well. But the industrial era was really interesting too, because this was the time that the elite class in civilization was starting to turn into something else. Because prior to that, in these ancient civilizations, it's like the elite class were pretty much always composed of some kind of like hereditary nobility or monarch or emperor figure, right? Once we started moving into the industrial era, we kind of had this cycling of elites where it's like the nobility actually started to fall in power, and the kind of wealthy capitalist class started to take the position as the new elites. And that's what makes up the elites today, right? So there was this significant turn there from somebody who just competed necessarily in warfare and had like hereditary title to someone who competed in commerce and didn't necessarily have a hereditary claim to that power. They earned it in the battlefield of economics, so to speak. But what we find across history is the fact that the vast majority of people have always been a part of this working class, right? And the way they have always been a part of this working class is because they have always been severely economically dependent. They did not own land, they had no access to it, they had to access it through other people. today, we're similar in the sense that, it's not necessarily agricultural land that we should own, but it's like we don't own the own means of our own production, right? We can't produce any of the things that we want or need on a regular basis, and so we have to access them through the entities that can produce those things, and that means working for them. Now, so you can kind of trace this line where we are modern day peasants in that sense, right? And I know that's a little bit of a radical thing to say because it's like, well, look at the room I'm in, look at this technology I'm using to record this, look at this iPad. Like, what? We're not peasants. Like, I'm not shoveling dung. Yes, not, it's not in an absolute sense, meaning like we're directly equivalent to them economically speaking, but in a relative sense we are. And I'm going to continue to make that case. And one of the things that I find really interesting when you study history is there's these terms that come from the Greeks. And there's this term that's called, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly. I'm very self-taught with a lot of this stuff, right? So I think it's penia, but I've only ever read it, never heard it spoken, obviously. I think it's penia, and it equates roughly to the idea of poverty, right? But it doesn't just equate to the idea of poverty, because really, in the ancient world, kind of like I've been saying, poverty was equivalent to not owning your own land. Like, if you did not have your own land, even just like a modest small plot, and you weren't like some, politician, and you weren't some member of, some type of like craftsman or tradesperson or something like that, it meant that you were going to be in poverty because essentially you would be a peasant who had to work someone else's land in order to get stuff from that land. It's like if you wanted the wheat from the land, it's like, well, it's not yours. You have to work that land on behalf of the person who owns it. Then you could get some of it. That was penia. That was poverty. Now, contrast to that was the idea of plutos, and that was the idea of wealth. But wealth really equated to someone who did have land, right? And moreover, like a lot of land, and so they controlled a lot of people who would work that land on their behalf. Now, the reason I bring this up is because today, a software engineer and a barista are similar in the sense that they both experience penia, right? Not that they both experience literal poverty, right? Because they probably don't. But in the sense that they don't own their own land, even a modest plot of it. Because unless they have substantial wealth that's able to produce a living income for themselves without having to lift a finger, it means that they don't own their own metaphorical land, right? And so in that sense, they have to sell their labor to somebody else who does own that metaphorical land, right? So to have Plutos today really means to have enough wealth, to have enough capital to stop working indefinitely. And so in that sense, the working class is people who are subject to penia. And that's almost everybody. Almost everybody. And another way to think about this is the idea of the proletariat. And the proletariat is basically, it describes a class of people. And composing that class of people are individual proles, and a prole is someone who must survive by selling their labor. And the term proletariat comes to us from ancient Rome, and that's because Rome divided their citizenry by census into ranks, where they had the equestrians on top, then they had class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, class 5 citizens, and finally they had the proletariat at the very bottom. And you can see that they classified these different classes of citizens basically by the wealth, the property that they had, and even the military equipment they might have. So the equestrians, the top class of people, not only had massive wealth, but they also had a horse. They had full armor and all kinds of weapons. And then you can go all the way to the bottom and say that the proletariat has no wealth to speak of, and they certainly have no equipment either. And this wealth was very much tied to land ownership. So it's like the class 1 citizen has way more land probably than the class 5 citizen. And so prole is basically, it's the Latin root of the term proletariat, and it means, what it actually means is offspring or children. And the reason that it's called that, the reason that they use the word prole and proletariat, is because this class of people's main contribution, like the way they saw these people's worth, was tied up into the fact that they were going to produce children, and that was essentially going to mean more bodies for labor, right? That's all they valued this class of people for, their bodies and the fact that they were going to produce more bodies, right? And so what's interesting is this term, the proletariat and the proles, it would be revived again in the industrial era because once again, people started realizing, hey, wait a minute. The vast majority of people are nothing more than like, we just have to sell the use of our bodies and our minds in order to survive. And so you can see it in all kinds of philosophical writing. You can see it in famous books like 1984. In that book, the citizenry was called proles, right? So this term got revived because people realized that the working class has always been this idea of like a prole. Like we are the modern proletariat if you're in the working class. Okay. Now at this point, I'm sure a number of you still have some concerns, and you might have this entire time been like, you know what, this guy's crazy, saying a bunch of shit that I really don't agree with. And one of the things I probably don't agree with this guy on is the fact that still I'm hung up on the fact that, okay, sure, might have been slaves and peasants and proletariat throughout history, but again, look at this room, right? Look at this computer behind me. Look at all the food in my fridge. Look at my running water, right? And it's like, of course, if we look at the living standards over time of the working class, they've gone up and to the right. Absolutely. But what about the other classes? What about the elite class? Well, they've certainly gone up and to the right too. And they've always been higher than the working class, of course. And so you can actually look at this a number of different ways and say, okay, yes, of course. The working class living standard has increased in absolute terms across history. There is no question that today I live a better life than a slave working for, a general person in the Roman Republic, right? There's probably no question about that in an absolute sense. And you could also make the point that in a relative sense, today, I live better probably than a medieval king or lord might have lived, right? They didn't have access to all the stuff that I have access to today. And so in that sense, from like a material living standard sense, yeah, I live better than a king today, probably. But in a relative sense to the elite class, it's like, well, their distance from us has kind of remained the same. Or if anything, it's actually gotten even further away, right? And I think that's the important thing to understand here, is that what I'm really talking about is class dynamics in terms of the power they have to control other aspects of society. And so it's like, while the living standards might have gone up and to the right over time in an absolute sense, in a relative sense, they haven't changed at all. The same dynamic that would have existed between a king and a peasant is very much the same dynamic that exists between an employee and a CEO of a massive multinational corporation, right? Obviously, there's some differences, but the general power dynamic still exists in the sense that they're able to control, all those things from the work iceberg, and they're able to control all of that for the majority of your day, the majority of the days of the week, the majority of your adult life. Now, I think these ideas are going to resonate differently with different people. And that's because if we look at something like the idea of the social contract, and the social contract is the idea that there's this implicit deal between us and society, about how, if I contribute my labor to society, I'm going to get stuff back, hopefully enough stuff back that I'm going to be able to build like a decent life for myself, right? If this social contract seems good and it seems fair to the workers of society, a lot of people aren't going to care that they're extremely economically independent and that they have to, get up for work every single day and that work controls a great deal of their life. Honestly, they're probably not going to care. And there's people I talk to every day on a regular basis who are like, yeah, you know what? I don't love working. I don't love my job. I don't love the way it controls me. I don't love how it seems like my real life only exists on the weekend or after 5 p.m. But it's not that bad. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to tolerate it. Honestly, I don't think that much about it as long as like football's on the TV on Sunday, right? So people can be totally fine with being in this type of environment as long as the social contract is good. And today you could argue that because of material living standards, the social contract is quite good. You could argue that in some sense, but you could also argue the sense that, well, we all kind of bought into this idea that, first of all, we were part, most people think of themselves as like, part of a middle class of people, or at least part of people who are like striving for this idea of like the American dream lifestyle of basically just being able to like get into the housing market, maybe build a family, that type of thing. The type of life that our grandparents and parents might have had, right? We kind of bought into this idea that this was the new normal, that from that point forwards, like following World War II, everything was going to continue to progress in that way, where every new generation was going to be able to have a better life, maybe even, than their grandparents or parents, right? That's what we all bought into. But now we're all realizing, as we talked about in detail in the last video, that that deal actually doesn't exist, right? It's much harder for us to access the basic essentials of the economy, like housing and that type of stuff, that is absolutely essential for building a good life. Our social contract is actually breaking down for our generation and probably for the following generations as well. And so in that type of world, I believe a lot more people are going to be questioning their place in a social hierarchy, the social contract itself, the relationship and deal they have with work. And all of this, I think, is currently encouraging and will continue to encourage a rise in this idea of class consciousness. This idea that this social pyramid we thought we lived under is actually not that at all, right? It's actually the same one that has existed for thousands of years, right? And it's one where we are all basically a member of this working class, where we are all economically dependent. We have very little control when it really comes down to it over our lives. And maybe some of us might want to express some disagreement about that. And so either this bothers you or it really doesn't, right? Obviously, I'm talking about it because this has bothered me. This has bothered me my entire life. So I set out to make some changes to protest against that in a sense. And I won some economic independence and freedom for myself. And if that, if the idea of that, how that's possible, and just learning more about all of this stuff, learning more about seeing society in this way, social classes in this way, relationships with work in this way. If that stuff interests you and if some of the things I've said resonate with you, maybe bother you, then consider following along because I'm going to be talking a lot more about this stuff. I'm going to be building a number of different playlists on it. And I would love to have you follow along. And so with that being said, that's going to be it for me today. And thanks for hanging out. Hope to see you again soon.